All right, so we're diving deep today, folks. Taking a closer look at the unsolved murder of Alexandria Burgos. This happened in Chicago back in 2014. We're using an episode of the Anatomy of Murder podcast as our main source. But, we like to put our own spin on things. We're going to be focusing on Millie. She's Alexandria's mother. And really try to understand how this tragedy, this horrible event, impacted her family.
Yeah, it's one of those stories, that really stays with you. You think about what happens after the news crews leave, after the headlines fade. The family is still left picking up the pieces, searching for justice, or in this case, dealing with the agonizing lack of it.
Right. And, what makes this case even more, I don't know, jarring, I guess, is that Chicago in 2014 actually had its lowest homicide rate in decades.
Yeah.
Like, think about that contrast.
It's almost like a cruel twist of fate. You'd think in a year with historically low violence, a young woman like Alexandria would be safe. But that's not how life works, is it?
No, it's not. And there's this idea that Millie brings up in the podcast, no militia. It means seeing no wrong in anyone. It just makes you wonder. I mean, did that inherent trust in people, that worldview, did it make the blow of Alexandria's murder even harder to process?
Oh, absolutely. How do you reconcile such senseless violence, such a violation, with a belief system that assumes good intentions? It has to shake you to your core.
And it sounds like Alexandria and her younger brother, Christian, they were really close. The podcast talks about how she was always defending him from bullies and stuff. And they had this laughter that was like contagious, apparently. Everyone loved being around them.
Yeah, and it's heartbreaking. Just thinking about Christian, he was at his girlfriend's apartment that night. They were celebrating a birthday, totally oblivious to what was happening just a few blocks away.
Yeah, it was a Saturday night. Everyone was out doing their own thing. Alexandria had been working. Then she went to see a friend's performance. Millie and her husband, they were at the movies. They seemed like really cautious parents, always scoping out the neighborhood before letting their kids go places, making sure it was safe.
Which makes it all the more shocking. It really highlights that random, almost arbitrary nature of violence. Like, you can take precautions, be careful, but sometimes bad things just happen.
And they did. So later that night, Alexandria goes to pick up Christian. She's waiting outside, and suddenly shots ring out. It's total chaos. Screaming, people running, breaking glass. Christian calls his parents absolutely frantic. Millie describes this like desperate, frantic drive to the hospital where Alexandria was actually born.
And then that moment, right, the doctor comes in, delivers the news no parent should ever have to hear. Their daughter, gone. Just like that.
I can't even imagine. And it's at this point in the podcast, I think, where it goes beyond just the crime scene tape. We start to get a sense of Alexandria as a person, not just a victim, a statistic, but a real human being.
And that's when the weight of the loss really hits you. They talk about how she loved old school music. Teddy Pendergrass was her favorite. Simple style, worked hard at school, had a part-time job.
She was saving up for college, too. Wanted to be a social worker, work with at-risk youth. I mean, that says so much about her character, right? Wanting to help those who needed it most.
It adds another layer of tragedy to her story. All that potential, all that compassion, just snuffed out in an instant.
The podcast mentions that her funeral was packed. They actually had to close the funeral home because so many people came to pay their respects. A testament to the impact she had on everyone who knew her.
Absolutely. Even in her short life, she made a difference. And it's clear that her loss was deeply felt by the entire community.
Then the podcast shifts to the investigation. And almost immediately, it's obvious the police are hitting roadblocks left and right.
The initial theories, gang violence, a vendetta, mistaken identity, none of them seemed to fit. There wasn't any gang activity in the area. The building was well maintained. And then there's this code of silence among residents. It's like hitting a brick wall.
I can't even imagine the frustration, right? You're grieving, desperate for answers, and then you have this wall of silence that makes it even harder to find the truth. Millie actually went back to the crime scene multiple times, tried talking to people, but, fear is a powerful thing.
It is. And that fear, that reluctance to cooperate with the police, it often stems from a history of mistrust. Negative experiences with law enforcement. It's a complex issue for sure.
So what do you do when even the community is afraid to speak up? The family is left feeling helpless, lost, dealing with a revolving door of detectives, not getting any straight answers. And then there's this bizarre twist. Millie's boss gets a call from Alexandria's phone, the phone that was supposed to be with the police as evidence.
Wait, really? That's incredibly strange. Does the podcast explain that? Was it a sign the investigation was still active? Or just some weird bureaucratic oversight?
Honestly, it just adds to the confusion and frustration the family's already going through. Like, What's actually going on behind the scenes? Is anyone truly fighting for Alexandria? And that's where this whole concept of secondary victimization comes in.
Right, right. It's something that's often overlooked when we talk about crime and justice. It's the trauma inflicted by the system itself, on top of the initial trauma of the crime.
It's like a double whammy.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
dealing with the worst possible loss, and then you're thrown into this maze of legalities, procedures, a lack of information. It's almost like being victimized all over again.
It's a nightmare, absolutely a nightmare.
And Millie has all these unanswered questions, Was the murder weapon ever found? Did they get fingerprints from the shell casings? Why was her daughter's case deemed a cold case without even telling them?
Those are perfectly valid questions. I mean, any parent in that situation would want to know. It's about needing answers, some way to make sense of the senseless.
But as one of the podcast hosts, Anna Nicolazzi, she is a former prosecutor, by the way, she explains that sometimes information is withheld to protect the investigation. They don't want to tip off a potential suspect or mess up a future prosecution. But that has to be so frustrating for families, right? Like, how can you just blindly trust the system when they're keeping you in the dark?
It's a tough balance, no doubt. On one hand, there's the need for transparency. The family has a right to know what's going on with the investigation. But then there's also the need to make sure justice is served, to protect the integrity of the case. It's a really difficult situation all around.
And that's actually where we're going to pick things up in part 2 of this deep dive. But before we go, I just want to say, Millie's strength and resilience throughout all of this, it's really remarkable.
It is. I mean, she could have easily given in to the grief, the anger, but instead she chooses to fight for justice, for her daughter's memory, for preventing other families from going through this same nightmare. It's truly inspiring.
It really is. We'll delve more into her advocacy work in the next part. But for now, let's leave our listeners with this question. What does justice even look like in a case like this, where answers seem impossible to find and closure feels out of reach?
Yeah, it's a question a lot of families grapple with, don't they, when you're caught in this system, this search for justice, when answers feel so out of reach. I mean, where do you find solace? Where do you even begin to define justice when faced with such a profound loss?
And in Millie's case, you really see her taking that grief, that frustration,
Oh,
and
yeah.
turning it into something positive, something constructive.
It's like she almost refuses to be a passive victim of circumstance. She becomes this advocate, not just for Alexandria, but for, all victims of gun violence. Like, by refusing to let her daughter's story be forgotten, she's taking back control. In a way, fighting back against that powerlessness she felt during the investigation.
That's a good point. And you see that in all these actions she takes. She sets up a scholarship at Wright College in Alexandria's name, plants a tree in her memory at her school garden, marches, fundraisers, all these things. It's like she's saying, you might have taken my daughter, but you won't take her impact. You won't take her legacy.
And by keeping Alexandria's story alive, she also brings attention to the issue of gun violence as a whole. It's not just a number, a statistic. It's a human tragedy that affects real people, real families, all the time.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that really stuck with me was her work with incarcerated men. The podcast talks about how she actually goes into prisons, speaks to them directly, urges them to put down the weapons, find a different path. It's almost like she's trying to break the cycle of violence,
Right.
One person at a time.
Right, that's so powerful. There's this profound sense of empathy in her actions. She doesn't see them as just criminals. She understands that violence often leads to more violence.
Yeah.
And that to create real change, you have to reach out to those who might be most likely to perpetuate that cycle.
And it brings us back to that idea of no militia. Even after everything she's been through, she still seems to hold on to that belief in the good in people, that possibility of redemption.
It's really incredible. It would be so easy to become bitter and angry, consumed by all that negativity. But instead, she chooses to focus on hope, on the potential for change. It's really inspiring.
Now, before we get too far off track, let's go back to the investigation for a second. We mentioned that Alexandria's case was eventually labeled a cold case. Could you explain what exactly that means for anyone listening who might not be familiar with that term?
Sure. So basically, a cold case is an investigation that has hit like a dead end. All the leads have dried up. There's no new information coming in. And basically, the case becomes inactive. It gets put on the back burner, so to speak. But it's important to remember that cold doesn't automatically mean closed. These cases can be reopened if new evidence pops up or if a detective decides to take another look at it, maybe with a fresh perspective or something.
So it's not completely hopeless, even if it feels that way. There's still a chance.
Exactly. And that's what Anna Nicolazzi, that former prosecutor from the podcast, really stresses to Millie. Don't give up. Keep pushing. Keep making noise. Keep asking questions. Homicide cases, they're never truly closed. And there are so many things that can lead to a break in the case, even years later. Advancements in forensic technology, a witness finally coming forward, a dedicated detective who decides to take a new approach. You never know what might trigger that breakthrough.
And from what we've heard about Millie, she doesn't seem like the type to give up easily.
Oh, absolutely not. She's a force to be reckoned with. And I think her story is such a powerful example of the importance of advocacy, of not letting these cases fade into the background. Families of victims, they deserve answers, they deserve justice, and they deserve to be heard.
You know, listening to the podcast, another thing that stood out was this whole discussion about support systems for families of homicide victims. It made me realize it's not just about catching the perpetrator, it's about helping those left behind navigate everything that comes after.
Right. It's crucial because the trauma of losing a loved one to violence, that's one thing. But then you layer on top of that the whole experience of dealing with the criminal justice system. It's overwhelming.
I mean, imagine trying to deal with a constantly changing team of detectives, mountains of paperwork, legal jargon you don't understand, this constant uncertainty about what's happening with the investigation.
It's like being hit by a truck and then another truck right after that.
Oof, that's a good way to put it.
That's why understanding this concept of secondary victimization is so important. These families, they need more than just empathy. They need practical support, clear communication, and access to resources to help them through this unbelievably difficult process.
And the podcast does a great job of connecting Alexandria's case to this broader issue of gun violence in the U.S.
Right.
It's not just about one family's tragedy, it's a reflection of this much bigger societal problem that we're all facing.
And the statistics are just mind-boggling. They mentioned that in 2020 alone, over 45,000 Americans died because of gun violence. That's a 25% increase from just 5 years earlier. And these aren't just numbers on a page. These are people, lives lost, families shattered, communities torn apart.
It's really a wake-up call. It forces us to confront the reality of this issue, and it highlights the need for real action, like on a national level. We need to do something.
We need to. We need better solutions, stricter gun control measures, absolutely, but also more mental health resources, better community outreach programs. It has to be a multifaceted approach, and it has to start with a collective commitment to creating a safer society for everyone.
So before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I think it's worth mentioning the power of storytelling, The Anatomy of Murder podcast, it does so much more than just lay out the facts of a case. It gives a voice to the victims, their families, the communities impacted by this violence.
It humanizes the issue. Instead of just headlines, we see real people. We hear their stories. It forces us to confront the real world consequences of these crimes. And hopefully it inspires us to do something about it, to work towards a future where these tragedies happen less and less.
Absolutely. So as we head into the final part of this deep dive, let's keep that in mind. This isn't just about a crime. It's about a life, a legacy, and the ongoing search for justice and healing. That search for justice, though, as we've seen, sometimes it involves a lot more than just, catching the person responsible. It's about, taking back control, finding a way to move forward, trying to make something positive out of something so horrible.
Yeah, trying to find meaning in the face of senseless loss. And also working to, make sure it doesn't happen again, to prevent future tragedies. And Millie's story really embodies all of that.
Right, like turning grief into action. I mean, the podcast ends with a call to action, actually. They remind listeners that Alexandria's case, it's still unsolved. They even give out the Chicago Crime Stoppers number, 1-800-535-STOP, just in case someone out there has information that could help.
It's a reminder that sometimes, all it takes is one person, one little piece of information, no matter how small it seems. And even if that breakthrough never happens, the fact that they're still sharing her story, keeping her memory alive, that's a form of justice in itself.
It's about making sure she's remembered for the life she lived, not just the way she died.
Exactly. And that's what's so powerful about Millie's approach. She doesn't dwell on the negative. She chooses to focus on the positive. She talks about Alexandria's dreams, her love of music, how kind she was. She celebrates the impact her daughter had on others, the people whose lives she touched.
And by doing that, she invites us to do the same, right? To remember Alexandria as this vibrant young woman, a woman who was passionate about helping other people, not just a victim of a senseless crime.
Yeah, it's a reminder that every life lost to violence, it represents so much more than that. All those possibilities that will never be realized, a future cut short. It makes you think about how we can build a world where, where those possibilities have a chance, where people like Alexandria have a chance to live out their dreams.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, what stood out to you the most about this story?
That's a good question. I think for me, it was that balance, the heartbreak, obviously, but also that unwavering hope that Millie embodies. She's dealing with something unimaginable, but she still finds a way to turn that grief into something positive, something that honors her daughter's memory and, works towards creating a better future for others. It's remarkable.
It really is. It reminds you that even in the darkest of times, there's always a glimmer of light, whether it's the hope for justice, or the power of remembrance, or just the unwavering love of a mother who refuses to let her daughter's spirit fade away.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those stories that sticks with you. It makes you think, it makes you want to do better, to be better.
And ultimately, that's what we're trying to do with these deep dives, right? We want to give our listeners something to think about, to spark conversations, to maybe even inspire some action. So as we close this chapter, we'll leave you with this. What will you take away from Alexandria's story? How will you choose to honor her memory? And how will you contribute to a future filled with hope instead of heartbreak? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.